It's time for an update on the war. The front lines haven't moved a lot since Russia left Kherson City in the middle of November, partly because the two sides had to move their forces and prepare for the next phase of the war, but also partly because the weather has just been pretty bad for military operations. There's been too much rain and too much mud. But there is fighting, and we now do have indications of where the next potential breakthroughs could be. This time I'm using maps from deepstatemap.live. I used to use maps from the Institute for the Study of War, but for some reason they don't include a distance indicator on the map, and that was something that many people requested. So if we start with the border to Belarus, then the most interesting thing is that Russia is apparently doing what they can to persuade Belarus to join the war, but Belarus keeps refusing to do so. Most lately, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has been in Minsk to supposedly try to persuade Belarus on this topic. But I will say that I think it's still unlikely that Belarus will do this. It's just an extremely unpopular idea in Belarus to join the war directly. They do help with training, but they don't want to help directly. We have seen recently, though, that Russia has launched some of the Iranian Shahid drones from Belarusian territory against Ukraine. This is noteworthy because we hadn't seen these drones for about 3 weeks or so. So people were starting to speculate that perhaps Russia had run out of Iranian drones, but apparently they still have them. And the guess is now that there were some technical problems with these Shahid drones that Russia had to fix so that they would work in cold temperatures. If we move on to the Sumy sector, then there is still some fighting across the border. So we are seeing some attacks both on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side of the border. And the same is more or less the case for the Kharkiv area. So it's definitely not quiet in these areas, but right now there is no real attempt to sort of push the front line beyond the international border. Then we get to the occupied areas. I think it makes sense to just reflect a bit on how the front line has changed over the last months. If we go back to September, then the front line was about 900 kilometers long, and there was fighting almost along the whole front line. And that meant that the two sides had many different options about where to attack and where to put pressure. But since Ukraine took back first the Kharkiv area and then the Kherson area, then the front line has gotten shorter. It's now about 750 kilometers. But importantly, almost 300 of those 750 kilometers are, in fact, the Dnipro River. And it's really hard to make a big attack across the river. So in reality, the front line where the two sides can decide to put pressure is now only about 450 kilometers. So that's about half as long as it was just a few months ago. And this means that things are more cramped together and that they just have fewer options. We are seeing that Ukraine is pushing hard in the Luhansk region, where they are slowly degrading the Russian defensive line, especially between the cities of Svatove and Kreminna. And it looks like this could be an area where Ukraine can perhaps get a breakthrough over the winter. I would not expect this to happen before we get a long period of cold weather, so the soil freezes. There has been a short period of freezing in the beginning of December, but now the mild weather has returned, so it's not good conditions for military operations right now. I will also not rule out the possibility that Ukraine actually plans on taking a kind of break over Christmas. So January seems like a good guess for the timing of a Ukrainian attack to get a breakthrough. But Luhansk is definitely a place to watch. Then a little south of that, Russia is pushing hard in the Donetsk region. For a while, there was pretty much across the entire Donetsk front line, but recently it's mostly been around the city of Bahkmut. Russia has been trying to take Bahkmut since the summer, and they are really trying hard to succeed this time. It's often said that it's the Wagner group that is attacking around Bahkmut, and that is true. But I think we should not assume that it is only Wagner mercenaries here. They are supported by the Russian military also. It will be interesting to see if they can take Bahkmut or if Ukraine will manage to fend them off. I will say, though, that Bahkmut is not super important in a strategic sense. Like if Russia takes this, then it will not dramatically shift the balance in the area. So frankly, it looks a bit like a kind of symbolic fight at this point, where the Russians are throwing a lot of forces into taking this city so that they can present it as a kind of PR victory. And I think the big question is how many losses they are taking here and if it's really worth it. In the southern sector, we are not really seeing a Ukrainian counteroffensive at this point. There is some fighting, but it's not a big offensive. Many observers still believe that Ukraine is going to make an attack toward Melitopol, and this would essentially cut the supply lines for the Russian troops in Kherson Oblast. But again, I would not expect such an attack until the weather gets colder, so there are better conditions for maneuver warfare. Then we have also heard quite a few stories about Ukrainian activity across the Dnipro River. This seems to mostly be special forces, but definitely there are Ukrainian troops on the eastern side of the river, or I guess it's the southern part of the river in this area, but you know what I mean. I think it's possible that Ukraine will try to establish a bridgehead so that they can start larger scale military operations across the river. A study from the Institute for the Study of War also shows that Russia is preparing defensive lines across the river with sort of fallback positions all the way to Crimea. So it looks like Russia is also expecting that Ukraine might cross the river. And the reason why that would make a lot of sense is that it would make the front line longer again. It is a problem for Ukraine that the front line is only 450 kilometers long. And if they can open up a new front line across the river, then they will get more options, and Russia will get more dilemmas about where to deploy their forces. I also just quickly want to touch on Russia's air campaign on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, especially the energy system. It's become a kind of pattern that Russia will do a new attack every 2-3 weeks. It looks like Russia doesn't have missiles enough to do attacks more often. And also these 2-3 weeks is about the time it takes for Ukraine to repair things from the last attack. So that's about then Russia can strike again. There was a new attack on December 5th. But it wasn't very successful this time. The Ukrainian air defense managed to shoot down most of the missiles, and the damages were pretty limited. So maybe Ukraine is learning how to defend against these attacks. Interestingly, the Russian President Putin appeared on international television, and he took full responsibility for the attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. He said that, yes, Russia is doing this, but Russia is justified in doing so because Ukraine hit the Crimean Bridge and stopped the water supply to occupied territories in Donetsk. I just don't know what to say. I mean, I just don't think they are going to accept that excuse in Hague. And seeing Putin saying these things with a sort of smirky smile on his face, like openly admitting that they are creating a humanitarian disaster for millions of Ukrainians, you know, it just made me think about how the people who talk about off-ramps for Putin and making compromises with Russia so that we can get peace, like how do these people see the question of justice for war crimes being a part of this deal? Like, is that really one of the compromises, that we should just forget about war crimes that Putin openly brags about on TV? Like, I think this question of prosecution of war crimes is going to be a major problem in any effort to reach a peace deal. But that's an aside. Back to the war. One of the reasons why the latest cruise missile attacks was a flop is perhaps that Ukraine attacked 2 Russian air bases just hours before the bombers were supposed to take off to send missiles to Ukraine. I have heard some analysts that sort of see it the other way around, that Ukraine attacked the air bases and then Russia did a quick strike as a retaliation. I am pretty confident that the Russian strike was planned a long time in advance and that Ukraine had intelligence information that it would be coming on that day, so they made a preemptive strikes on some of the key airfields. And I think most people were surprised that Ukraine could hit targets 500-600 kilometers into Russia. But apparently Ukraine has drones that can do this. Either they have repurposed old Soviet-era drones called Tupolev 141, or they have developed a new kind of drone with those sorts of ranges. So the big question is, of course, now how many of these drones Ukraine has, because if they have many, then that is something that can change the dynamics in the war in the long run. And then, of course, the big question is also why the Russians didn't manage to shoot the drones down, because the Russian air defense system is definitely not supposed to let Ukrainian drones fly 500 kilometers into Russia and then hit a strategically important airbase. So it will be really interesting to see if there will be more attacks like this coming in the future. I want to finish with a few reflections on some comments that the Director of National Intelligence in the United States, Avril Haines, made about what to expect for the war over the winter. She said that the U.S. expects the fighting to slow down over the winter because both sides will seek an operational pause to refit, resupply, and reconstitute for a new offensive in the spring. Well, both sides, that means both Ukraine and Russia. And I can say with a high degree of certainty that when it comes to Ukraine, then that assessment is just wrong. There is absolutely no chance whatsoever that Ukraine wants to give Russia a pause. I have a hard time believing that this is actually the assessment of the American intelligence community. So I think Avril Haines just misspoke on that point. But when it comes to Russia, then what Avril Haines said basically touches on the same question that I raised in my last video, where I looked at whether Russia is going for a long war or a quick war. I framed it like that, as a long war or a quick war, but essentially the question was whether we should expect Russia to go for an operational pause over the winter, or whether they will continue to have offensive aspirations in the short term. And to illustrate how confusing this question is, I just want to show this daily assessment from December 7th from the Institute for the Study of War, where they discuss the problem. First, they write that Putin is setting conditions for a protracted war because of some statements that he made. And then they go on to citing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg that Russia seeks an operational pause over the winter. So Jens Stoltenberg basically says the same thing as Avril Haines, that Russia wants to freeze the fighting and take a pause to prepare for a spring offensive. ISW then notes that Stoltenberg's statements supports ISW's assessment that an operational pause would favor Russia by depriving Ukraine of the initiative. Well, so far, so good. But then ISW goes on to making the same observation that I did in my video last week, that Putin continues to seem unwilling to pursue such a cessation of fighting, however. The Russian military is continuing offensive operations around Bahkmut and is, so far, denying itself of the operational pause that would be consistent with best military practice. So there seems to be a kind of consensus that it would be smart for Russia, from a military point of view, to seek an operational pause, but for whatever reason, it doesn't actually look like that's what they're trying to do. So the Russian strategy for the winter is confusing, and maybe that is a deliberate choice on their part, like I suggested in my last video, or maybe it's more a question of bad coordination where they don't really have a plan. But whatever the reason, I don't think we should expect the fighting to slow down significantly over the winter. So I think Avril Haines is wrong on that point. Rather, we should expect the fighting to intensify when the weather gets colder in January and February. And Ukraine will definitely want to do that. And I think it looks like Russia also wants to push on. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video useful, please give it a like. And also remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.